sufficient to express the great honor and the privilege of welcoming everyone to the place where the United States was born. We are now standing in the actual room where 3 of America's founding documents were adopted. Could everyone please take a few seconds to carefully count the number of tables that are arranged here? As you count the tables, do you notice that for the first time in history that a meeting of all colonies assembled in this room? They met to debate their growing differences with the king and parliament, and they described themselves as members of the Second Continental Congress. Just 3 weeks prior to their arrival, bullets were fired on a battlefield in Massachusetts. With those shots that were fired at Lexington and
Concord,
the famous shots that were around the world, with those opening shots, the War for Independence officially began. Despite the fighting, the delegates were destined to meet for an entire year before agreeing to produce a document which would explain to a candid world the reasons behind the revolution. And they referred to this great document as the Declaration of Independence. Ladies and gentlemen, I have to confess to you that this is merely a $5 copy from our gift shop. It's not a bad copy, but a copy nonetheless. Now, you look at this copy, folks. Do you recall how the author, Thomas Jefferson, listed the grievances over taxation without representation in Parliament? He also criticized the quartering of British troops in the homes of the people. Along those grievances, we also remember how Jefferson raised some pretty radical ideas about liberty and freedom. One of the most radical ideas was the notion that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are equal, and that they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these rights are some of the most profound and inspiring concepts in all of modern times. We know that Jefferson worked extremely hard in the drafting of his declaration, and that when he completed it, that he eagerly presented it before his fellow delegates that were seated around the room. As he passed this document around the room, does anyone happen to recall precisely what these delegates did to his declaration? Did they give it an A+ after he wrote it? No. What did they do with this document? Did they leave it exactly as he wrote it? No. What did they do?
It was edited.
They edited it, yeah. They read it, they criticized it, and they edited it. Multiple changes were made. And then when it was all over, Jefferson said, this Congress, they mangled my documents. But despite those changes that were made, in July, a country was born right here in Philadelphia. Delegates, members of Congress, I don't want to spoil our enthusiasm about becoming independent, but we need a serious reality check. Apparently, as a group, we just committed an act of treason against the most powerful empire on the face of the earth. Is there a country that will help America achieve its independence? The French. Yeah, France is our biggest ally. We have France as our ally. Do we have any other allies? What about the country just below France? Spain was also militarily involved, and the Dutch, they'll provide financial support. This will become a global struggle. Folks, this is very tragic, but the war also divided families. One particular family that was divided over the cause of independence was the family of Miss Simon. Does the name look familiar, folks? Beautiful handwriting. Who's this guy? Sorry. Yeah, that's okay. Yeah, right there. Benjamin Franklin. Yes, we have Benjamin Franklin. Fellas, while Mr. Franklin was putting his name to the Declaration, Mr. Franklin's son, William, at the time, he was serving as the royal governor for New Jersey. He was appointed by the king. While the father supported independence, who do you think the son was supporting? England. He supported the king, yes. And the two men never reconciled. Ultimately, Franklin's son left America. He is actually buried in the city of London. This is an example of a family divided over the cause of independence. Oh, wait a minute, folks. Wait a minute. We have a slight dilemma here, and I need your advice to solve this dilemma. In the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson eloquently writes that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are. However, at the same time, in 1776, was everyone treated equally?
No.
Absolutely not. And this is what they call the paradox. But have you heard the good news, folks? The Declaration of Independence is a document of promise. Promise doesn't occur overnight, but ultimately, this promise will spread to encourage freedom to all people. Ladies and gentlemen, does this man look familiar? If he does, will you please say his name? Let me show you his picture. Does this man look familiar?
Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln.
Ladies and gentlemen, didn't Abraham Lincoln mention the Declaration of Independence in his famous Gettysburg Address? Ladies and gentlemen, didn't Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton mention the Declaration in the struggle for women's equality? Didn't Frederick Douglass and who was this man?
Martin Luther King.
Then they also refer to the Declaration of Independence. It truly is a document of freedom, a promise of freedom to all. Folks, I would like to apologize to everyone for talking much too long. Folks, do you realize that we've been talking for so long that 11 years have just gone by? You know why it's so stuffy in this room? It's because it is now the summer of 1787. As you look around the room, you notice delegates have gathered here from across the country, and they've come here to correct a document called the Articles of Confederation, a document in which the states have most of the power. Although they don't have permission, what they're going to do is replace the Articles with a strong central government under the U.S. Constitution. Folks, I would like to ask, does everybody notice the chair on the platform, the chair in the center of the room? Well, we regard that chair to be a national treasure. That is the very chair that was used by George Washington, sat in that very chair throughout the summer of 1787. While His Excellency was sitting in that chair, the delegates came together and they compromised over the three parts of government with their equal checks and powers. They achieved a compromise between the large states and the small states over representation. And as in this room, they also made the compromises over the powers and the functions of the U.S. president. And what was really extraordinary is that the founders understood that well into the future, that America would grow and change. And that in the future, that opinions about issues would also change. Therefore, they shaped the Constitution to also reflect those coming changes. And what was that wonderful process called, where we made changes to the Constitution? Amendment process. We can amend the Constitution. If we continue to grow as a people, the Constitution can also reflect those changes. Well, there was a distinguished man who was seated somewhere in this area. His name was Benjamin Franklin. And while he was helping to shape the Constitution, Franklin made a very astute observation. Franklin observed that in this room, there appears to be an image, a carving of a sun. Ladies and gentlemen, where do you see this image in this room? It's on the back of the chair. It's on the back of Washington's chair, right above Washington's head. You can see it on the chair. Well, looking above Washington's head at the sun, Franklin questioned whether the sun, or by extension, whether the nation would represent a rising or a setting sun. Could these men unite and write a constitution? Franklin tells us that it wasn't until they signed the Constitution that he had the happiness to know that this is a rising and not a setting sun. That's Franklin's way of showing his optimism. His way of demonstrating the ability to compromise. Perhaps this will be rising and not a sitting republic. Well, we'd like to take the time to, first of all, thank you for your visit today. We thank you for your patience. Our tour is basically concluded. As you visit the documents in the West Wing and also Congress Hall, we ask that you please use the available doors in the rear. And if you have any special questions, we'll also try to answer all questions as we go to the rear of Independence Hall.